Elena pressed her back against the cold stone wall of the cabin, her heart hammering so hard she thought the whole forest could hear it. Somewhere behind her, wrapped in a torn wool blanket, the newborn pup let out a soft whimper. She clamped a hand over her own mouth to keep from crying out. Footsteps crunched on dry leaves outside. Someone was close, too close. She had only given birth 6 hours ago, alone, in the dark, because she could not risk anyone seeing what had come into the world. The pup was silver, not gray, not white, but a deep, shimmering silver that seemed to catch even the faintest moonlight and throw it back like a mirror. Every wolf in the Blackthorn pack knew what that color meant. It was the mark the elders spoke of in hushed, frightened voices around the fire. The mark of the old prophecy. The mark that supposedly brought ruin to any pack foolish enough to let such a pup live. Elena did not believe in curses. She believed in her son. The footsteps stopped just outside the cabin door. She held her breath. A voice called out, low and rough, belonging to Garrick, one of the pack's border scouts. He was asking if anyone was inside, saying he smelled fresh blood and newborn scent carried on the wind. Elena's stomach turned to ice. She looked down at the tiny bundle in her arms, at the delicate silver fur already catching light from the cracks in the wooden shutters, and she made a decision that would follow her for the rest of her life. She pressed her palm against the pup's chest, feeling the impossibly fast heartbeat beneath her fingers, and she whispered for him to stay quiet, though of course a newborn could not understand words yet. It was more for herself than for him. Garrick knocked once, twice, then tried the door handle. It was locked, but the old wood was weak, and Elena knew it would not hold forever. She had perhaps 30 seconds before he found another way in, or simply broke it down. Thinking fast, she wrapped the pup tighter, and slipped through the back window she had left open, for exactly this reason, dropping 3 feet into the mud below, cradling him against her chest to soften the fall. She ran, barefoot, through the underbrush, thorns tearing at her ankles, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind her, she heard the cabin door finally give way with a crack of splintering wood. Garrick's voice rang out again, calling for backup, saying he had found the scent trail and it led toward the eastern ridge. Elena changed direction immediately, cutting west instead, deeper into a part of the territory few wolves bothered to patrol because it bordered a ravine too dangerous to cross safely. She had grown up near here as a pup herself. She knew a narrow ledge that most did not, a hidden path behind a curtain of hanging roots that led to a small cave carved into the rock. She reached the cave just as her legs began to give out from exhaustion and blood loss. Sliding inside, she pulled dead brush across the entrance behind her, then collapsed against the cold stone, clutching her son to her chest, listening to the sounds of the search party moving further away, their voices growing faint, then fading entirely into the wind. For a long moment, all she could hear was her own ragged breathing and the tiny, steady breaths of the pup against her collarbone. She looked down at him properly for the first time since fleeing. His eyes were not yet open, as was normal for a newborn, but even in sleep, his small face seemed calm, unaware of the danger already surrounding him, unaware that his very existence was considered a threat by the pack that was supposed to protect him. Elena touched his tiny paw with one finger and felt something fierce rise up inside her chest, something that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with love. She thought of the pack elders and their endless warnings about silverborn wolves. She thought of old matron Yvain, who had once told a room full of young mothers that a pup born with that coloring would bring a season of death upon the pack, that the only mercy was to leave such a pup exposed to the elements before it could grow strong enough to fulfill whatever dark purpose the prophecy described. Elena had been 11 years old when she heard that story, and it had haunted her ever since, though she never imagined she would one day be the mother standing at the center of it. She had not told anyone who the father was. That was a secret buried even deeper than the pup's coloring, one she intended to carry to her grave if necessary, because if the pack elders discovered the truth of Cale's parentage alongside his cursed coloring, there would be no mercy at all. Not for her, not for him, not for anyone connected to either of them. The night stretched on, cold and silent, broken only by the distant call of an owl somewhere above the ravine. Elena did not sleep. She could not risk closing her eyes, not with search parties still combing the forest, not with her son's life hanging by the thinnest of threads. She spent the hours memorizing every sound the cave made, every shift of wind through the hanging roots, every drip of water somewhere deeper in the rock, because she needed to know instantly if anyone approached. By the time dawn light began filtering weakly through the brush covering the cave entrance, Elena had made her plan. She could not stay in the cave forever. She needed supplies, warmth, a way to feed herself so she could keep feeding him. She needed to return to the pack, at least for a while, and pretend that nothing unusual had happened, that her sudden absence the night before had simply been a private matter, a woman seeking solitude to grieve a stillbirth perhaps. It was a dangerous lie, but it was the only one she could think of that might explain her disappearance without raising suspicion about what she had actually delivered. She kissed her son's forehead gently, breathing in his scent, memorizing it the way new mothers do, and then she wrapped him even more securely and carried him deeper into the cave system, to a dry alcove she remembered from childhood exploration, one shielded from wind and mostly hidden from casual view. She built a small nest of dry leaves and moss, checked twice that he was warm enough, and forced herself to leave him there alone for the first time, promising in a whisper that she would return before midday. Walking back toward the packlands felt like walking toward her own execution. Every rustle of leaves made her flinch. Every distant howl sent ice through her veins. By the time the main lodge came into view, she had composed her face into something resembling calm exhaustion, the look of a woman who had lost a child in the night, not one who had hidden a living, breathing secret in a cave 3 miles away. Garrick was the first to spot her. He jogged over, his expression a mixture of relief and confusion, asking where she had been all night, saying the whole search party had been looking for her, after finding blood and birth scent near the old forest cabin. Elena forced tears to her eyes, not difficult given the very real fear still coursing through her body, and told him the child had not survived, that she had panicked and run into the woods in her grief, that she had buried the pup herself because she could not bear for anyone to see. Garrick's face softened with sympathy, and he did not press further, though something in his eyes lingered a moment too long on her face, as if some instinct told him not everything added up. He offered to escort her back to her quarters, and she accepted, letting him walk beside her in silence through the pack grounds, past wolves who glanced at her with pity, unaware of the truth hidden behind her carefully arranged grief. It was only later that day, alone in her small room, that Elena allowed herself to shake, to finally process what she had done, and what she still had to do. She had lied to an entire pack. She had hidden a child whose very existence violated ancient law. And somewhere out there, watching over everything from his position at the top of the pack hierarchy, was Alpha King Draven Blackthorn, a wolf known throughout the region for his sharp instincts and his unwillingness to tolerate deception within his ranks. Elena had heard the stories about him since she was young, how he had taken control of the pack after a brutal challenge that left the previous Alpha unable to lead, how he ruled with a mixture of strength and surprising fairness that had earned him loyalty from wolves who might otherwise have resented a young leader. She had also heard whispers, quieter ones, about a night during the blood moon several seasons past, when strange magic had swept through the territory, affecting wolves in ways no one fully understood, blurring memories, creating connections between individuals who would otherwise never have crossed paths. She pushed that thought away quickly, locking it in the same mental vault where she kept Kale's true parentage, because dwelling on it now, with everything else threatening to collapse around her, felt like inviting disaster to arrive even faster than it already was. That evening, she waited until the pack settled into its nightly routines, until most wolves retreated to their dens, and the patrol schedules shifted to the smaller night watch, and then she slipped away again, following the same path toward the ravine, carrying a small satchel of food and warm cloth she had managed to gather without drawing attention. Her heart lifted the moment she heard the soft, healthy sounds of her son stirring in his nest of leaves, and she scooped him up, checking every inch of him for any sign of cold or distress, relieved beyond words to find him warm and breathing steadily. She fed him, she held him, and she allowed herself, just for a moment, to imagine a different life, one where his silver fur was celebrated instead of feared, where he could grow up running through open meadows instead of hiding in a damp cave 3 miles from everyone who might otherwise have loved him. It was a fragile, dangerous hope, but it was the only thing keeping her moving forward. As she made her way back to the pack grounds before sunrise, unaware that a pair of sharp eyes had already begun tracking her movements from a distance, Elena had no idea that her carefully constructed secret was already beginning to unravel, thread by thread, and that the wolf, who would eventually discover the truth, was far closer to her than she ever could have imagined. The following days blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and constant vigilance. Elena resumed her pack duties, tending to the communal gardens and helping prepare meals for the lower-ranking wolves, all while slipping away at every possible opportunity to check on Kale, to feed him, to simply hold him and remind herself why she was carrying this impossible weight. She grew thinner, the strain showing in the hollows beneath her eyes, and though she tried to hide her exhaustion behind polite smiles and quiet efficiency, she knew it would not go unnoticed forever. Word had already begun to spread through the pack about her strange behavior on the night of the search, about the story of a lost child that did not quite match the confused, contradictory details other wolves had gathered from the birth scent and blood found near the cabin. Whispers followed her through the corridors of the lodge, quiet enough that she could pretend not to hear them, but persistent enough that she knew her secret existed on borrowed time. And somewhere at the heart of the pack, in the grand chamber reserved for the Alpha's private council, Draven Blackthorn sat listening to reports from his most trusted enforcers, his sharp golden eyes narrowing as he processed information that did not sit right in his gut. A pup had supposedly died and been buried without proper pack ritual. A grieving mother had wandered the forest alone for an entire night, and underneath it all, faint but undeniable, was a scent report from one of his trackers, describing something unusual carried on the wind near the eastern ridge, a scent that did not match any registered wolf in his territory, yet somehow felt strangely, impossibly familiar. Draven did not believe in coincidence, and as he dismissed his council for the evening, he made a private decision to look into the matter himself, unaware that doing so would lead him toward a truth that would shake the very foundations of everything he believed about loyalty, fear, and the family he did not yet know he had. Elena's hands trembled as she folded the last clean cloth into her satchel, glancing over her shoulder for the third time in as many minutes. The morning sun had barely cleared the treetops, and already she felt the weight of being watched, though every time she turned there was nothing but empty corridor and the distant sound of pack life stirring awake. She told herself it was paranoia, the natural result of too many sleepless nights and too much fear pressed into too little time. But a part of her, the old animal instinct buried deep in every wolf, insisted otherwise. 10 days had passed since Kale's birth, and somehow, against every fear that gripped her chest each night, he was thriving. His silver coat had grown even more striking, catching light in ways that seemed almost unnatural, shimmering faintly, even in the dim cave where she kept him hidden. His eyes had finally opened, revealing a pale gray so light it bordered on silver as well, and when he looked up at her, Elena felt something in her chest crack open every single time, a mixture of overwhelming love and bone-deep terror that she carried everywhere she went. She had grown skilled at moving unseen through the forest paths, timing her visits around patrol rotations she had memorized through careful observation over the years. But lately, something felt different. Twice now she had caught the faint scent of another wolf near the ravine path, a scent she could not immediately place, masculine and strong, laced with something that made the fur along her spine bristle, without her fully understanding why. She pushed the feeling aside and continued toward the cave, moving quickly and quietly, following the hidden route behind the hanging roots. Kale greeted her with the soft mewling sound he always made when hungry, and she settled into the alcove, feeding him and checking his small body for warmth, for any sign that the dampness of the cave might be affecting his health. He seemed strong, resilient in a way that surprised her, as if something in his blood refused to be weakened by circumstance. As she sat there in the dim light, humming softly to soothe him back to sleep, she allowed her mind to wander toward memories she usually forced away, memories of the blood moon several seasons past, a night when strange magic had swept through the territory unlike anything the pack had witnessed before or since. She remembered fragments only, disjointed images of moonlight bending strangely across the clearing, of finding herself in the company of a wolf she barely knew, someone whose presence had struck her even through the haze of the magic affecting them both. She remembered golden eyes, sharp and intelligent even then, and a voice that carried authority even in confusion. She had woken the next morning in her own den, memory hazy, uncertain what exactly had happened during those lost hours, and she had told herself it did not matter, that whatever had occurred was a product of magic beyond anyone's control, and therefore beyond anyone's responsibility. She had continued her life as normal for weeks afterward, until the unmistakable signs of pregnancy began to show, and by then, it was far too late to unravel the mystery of the night that had created the child now sleeping against her chest. She had never told anyone the identity of the wolf from that night, partly because her own memory remained frustratingly incomplete, and partly because instinct told her that revealing such information would only compound the danger already surrounding her and her son. But sitting there in the cave, watching Cale's chest rise and fall with steady breaths, she could not deny the flicker of familiarity that sometimes crossed her mind when she thought of golden eyes and quiet authority. A flicker she refused to fully examine, because doing so felt like opening a door she was not prepared to walk through. A sound outside the cave entrance snapped her back to the present, and her whole body went rigid. She listened carefully, straining to identify the source, and heard nothing but wind moving through the brush. Still, her instincts screamed at her to be careful, and she gathered Cale quickly, holding him close, preparing to retreat further into the cave system if necessary. Minutes passed in tense silence before she finally relaxed enough to breathe normally again, chalking the sound up to a passing deer, or perhaps a bird disturbed from its perch. She resettled Cale into his nest of leaves, reinforcing the warmth around him with an extra layer of cloth, and prepared to make her way back to the pack grounds before her absence became noticeable. What she did not know, could not have known, was that the sound she heard had indeed been caused by a wolf, one who had been tracking her scent trail for the better part of an hour, moving with practiced stealth learned through years of leading border patrols before rising to his current position of power. Draven Blackthorn had grown suspicious enough over the previous days that he decided to investigate the Eastern Ridge himself, unwilling to trust the matter entirely to his enforcers, especially after Garrick's report about Elena's strange behavior on the night of the alleged stillbirth continued to nag at him. He had followed her scent partway, before losing the trail near a rocky outcropping, his sharp senses momentarily confused by the way the wind swirled unpredictably through the ravine's uneven terrain. He crouched low, studying the ground for any sign of disturbed earth or broken branches, his golden eyes narrowing as he pieced together fragments of information that still refused to form a complete picture. He knew Elena, of course, in the distant way an alpha knows every member of his pack, aware of her name, her role among the lower ranks, her quiet, unassuming presence at communal gatherings. He had never paid her particular attention before, seeing her as simply another loyal wolf among many, until the events of the past 10 days forced her into the periphery of his concerns. Now, crouched in the underbrush, studying faint impressions in the mud, he found himself wondering what exactly she was hiding, and why the answer felt more important than it probably should have. He straightened eventually, deciding the trail had gone cold for the moment, and made his way back toward the main pack grounds, resolving to keep a closer, quieter watch on Elena's movements without alerting her to his suspicions. He did not yet believe anything supernatural or dangerous was at play, assuming instead some private grief, or perhaps a secret relationship she wished to keep hidden from prying eyes, a common enough occurrence among pack members navigating complicated social hierarchies. Back at the lodge, Draven called Marcus, his most trusted enforcer, into his private chamber, laying out his concerns plainly, and asking him to discreetly monitor Elena's activities over the coming days, cautioning him against alarming her or drawing unwanted attention. Marcus, a broad-shouldered wolf with sharp instincts of his own, agreed readily, curious himself about the strange scent reports that had circulated among the tracking teams since the night of the supposed stillbirth. Meanwhile, Elena returned to her duties that afternoon, unaware of the quiet net beginning to close around her secret. She worked through her assigned tasks with mechanical precision, her mind constantly drifting toward the cave and the small, fragile life depending entirely on her continued vigilance. She noticed, with a growing unease she could not quite name, that Marcus seemed to appear near her more frequently than usual over the following 2 days, always with some plausible reason for his presence, always polite and unassuming, yet somehow deliberate in a way that set her nerves on edge. She began varying her routes to the ravine, taking longer, more circuitous paths to ensure she was not followed, doubling back occasionally to check for signs of pursuit. The added distance meant less time she could spend with Cale each visit, and she felt the strain of divided attention wearing at her, both physically and emotionally, as the days blurred together, in an exhausting rhythm of deception and devotion. On the 5th day of this heightened caution, disaster nearly struck when she arrived at the cave to find fresh paw prints near the entrance, prints that did not belong to her. Her heart seized with terror as she rushed inside, only to find Cale still safely nestled in his hidden alcove, seemingly undisturbed, his small chest rising and falling in peaceful sleep. She checked every corner of the cave, every possible hiding spot, before concluding that whoever had left those prints had not ventured deep enough to discover her son, though the near miss left her shaking with adrenaline for hours afterward. She resolved that night, sitting beside Cale in the dim cave light, that she needed a better solution than simply hoping the search parties would eventually lose interest. She needed to find somewhere more secure, somewhere further from prying eyes, even if it meant a longer, more dangerous journey each time she wished to see her son. The thought of separating herself further from him tore at her heart, but the alternative, discovery and everything that would follow, felt infinitely worse. She spent the following days scouting quietly during her limited free time, searching for a new location deep enough in the forest to avoid casual patrols, yet close enough that she could still reach it without arousing suspicion through prolonged absences. She found a promising spot eventually, an abandoned den once used by a family of foxes, tucked beneath the roots of an ancient oak tree, nearly 4 miles from the pack grounds, further than she would have liked, but seemingly secure enough to justify the added risk. Moving Cale proved to be the most terrifying journey of her life so far, carrying him wrapped tightly against her chest through unfamiliar terrain in the dead of night, every snap of a twig sending panic surging through her veins. She arrived at the new den, exhausted but relieved, settling him into the deeper, more secure space, with a silent prayer that this location would offer him better protection than the cave had. She did not know, could not have known, that even as she settled her son into his new hiding place, Draven Blackthorn was piecing together fragments of information that would soon lead him directly to her doorstep, and that the collision course between her carefully guarded secret and the Alpha King's relentless instincts had already been set in motion, unstoppable now, regardless of how carefully she moved or how far she ran. Marcus stood at the edge of the training grounds, arms crossed, watching Elena move through her daily chores with a practiced calm that almost convinced him nothing was wrong. Almost. He had been tailing her discreetly for nearly a week now, and while she had grown noticeably more careful in her movements, varying her routes and timing her disappearances around patrol schedules with impressive precision, small inconsistencies kept surfacing that his trained eyes could not ignore. Today she had left the herb garden earlier than usual, claiming exhaustion, and disappeared toward the northern trail, before doubling back unexpectedly and cutting west instead, a pattern he recognized immediately as deliberate evasion. He reported this to Draven that evening, along with his growing suspicion that whatever Elena was hiding involved travel to a specific location she was determined to protect at all costs. Draven listened carefully, his jaw tight with the particular frustration of a leader who valued transparency among his people, and found himself confronted with obvious deception from someone he had never previously considered capable of such elaborate concealment. He instructed Marcus to widen the search perimeter, to enlist a second tracker if necessary, but to proceed with caution, unwilling to corner Elena in a way that might cause her to do something reckless out of panic. What Draven did not fully understand yet, what gnawed at him in quiet moments between council meetings and territorial disputes, was why this particular mystery had lodged itself so firmly in his mind when countless other pack matters demanded his attention. He told himself it was simply his responsibility as Alpha to understand every thread of deception within his territory, that the strange scent reports from the ravine and the eastern ridge represented a potential threat he could not afford to ignore. But some quieter part of him, one he rarely acknowledged even to himself, sensed something deeper at play, something that pulled at instincts older than his current position of leadership. Meanwhile, Elena's life had become an exhausting balance of vigilance and exhaustion. The new den beneath the ancient oak offered better protection than the cave had, but the additional distance meant she could visit only twice a day at most, and each journey left her drained, her muscles aching from the rushed pace she maintained to minimize her time away from pack duties. Cale, now nearly 3 weeks old, had grown stronger and more alert, his silver eyes tracking her movements with obvious recognition each time she arrived, his small paws reaching toward her in a way that made her chest ache with love every single time. She began noticing small changes in him that both delighted and worried her. His growl, when he play-fought with the small stick she had brought him to gnaw on, carried a resonance deeper than she expected for a pup his age. His senses seemed sharper too, his head turning toward sounds long before she herself could detect them, as if some heightened awareness had been woven into his very blood. She wondered, not for the first time, whether the silver coloring carried more than mere pigment, whether the old prophecy the elders feared held some grain of truth buried beneath generations of exaggeration and superstition. She refused to dwell too long on such thoughts, focusing instead on the practical matters of keeping him fed, warm, and hidden. She had begun supplementing her visits with small amounts of soft meat smuggled from the communal kitchens, carefully timed to avoid suspicion from the kitchen staff, who tracked supplies with meticulous attention. Every stolen scrap felt like a small victory. Another day her son would survive, despite everything working against him. On the 10th day since relocating Cale to the new den, disaster arrived in a form Elena had not anticipated. She had just settled him for his midday feeding when the unmistakable sound of approaching footsteps reached her ears. Too close, too deliberate, to be anything other than a wolf, tracking directly toward her location. Panic surged through her body as she quickly gathered Cale, pressing him against her chest, and pressing herself flat against the darkest corner of the den, praying the shadows would be enough to conceal them both. The footsteps stopped just outside the entrance, and Elena heard a voice she recognized instantly as Marcus, calling out cautiously, asking if anyone was present, his tone carrying the careful neutrality of someone conducting an official search, rather than a casual patrol. Her heart pounded so violently, she feared he might hear it even through the den's earthen walls. Cale, sensing her fear perhaps, or simply hungry and impatient, began to stir, a small whimper building in his throat that Elena desperately tried to soothe with gentle pressure and quiet, urgent shushing. For several agonizing seconds, it seemed as though the whimper might escape into the open air, might reach Marcus's sharp ears, and end everything in an instant. But Elena, drawing on some deep reserve of desperate maternal instinct, pressed her palm gently but firmly against Cale's small chest, humming the lowest, quietest tune she could manage, a lullaby her own mother had once sung to her, and miraculously, the whimper faded into a soft, contented sigh instead. Marcus lingered outside for what felt like an eternity, his footsteps shifting slightly as he apparently circled the base of the ancient oak, investigating the area with the thoroughness of a trained enforcer. Elena held her breath, every muscle in her body locked in tense stillness, until finally, after what must have been several full minutes, his footsteps began retreating, moving away from the den and back toward the main trail, evidently satisfied that nothing of note existed in this particular location. She did not move for a long time after the sounds faded entirely, waiting until she was absolutely certain he had gone, before allowing herself to breathe normally again. Tears streamed down her face as the adrenaline drained from her body, leaving behind bone-deep exhaustion and a fresh wave of terror at how close they had come to discovery. She held Cale tightly, rocking him gently, whispering apologies for the fear she had put him through, though of course he understood none of it, already drifting back toward peaceful sleep against her chest. That evening, walking back toward the pack grounds on shaking legs, Elena understood with sudden clarity that her secret could not remain hidden indefinitely. The search efforts were intensifying, the near misses growing more frequent and more dangerous, and she knew that sooner or later, perhaps very soon, someone would find what she was so desperately trying to protect. The question that haunted her now was not whether discovery would come, but what she would do when it finally did. She considered, briefly and painfully, whether she should flee the territory entirely, taking Cale far beyond Blackthorn lands, to some distant pack where his silver coloring might not carry the same cursed reputation, where they might build a quiet life, free from the constant fear that gripped her every waking moment. But such a journey, alone with a newborn pup through unfamiliar and potentially hostile territories, carried its own overwhelming dangers, and she knew realistically that survival outside pack protection would be nearly impossible for either of them. She returned to her quarters that night, unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling as her mind raced through impossible scenarios, each one ending in some form of disaster she felt powerless to prevent. It was during these dark, sleepless hours that she finally allowed herself to fully consider the identity of Cale's father, wondering whether revealing that particular truth, should discovery become unavoidable, might somehow shift the balance of danger in her favor rather than compounding it further. She still could not be entirely certain, her memories of the blood moon night remaining frustratingly fragmented, but the golden eyes she remembered, the quiet authority in that unfamiliar voice, all pointed toward a possibility so significant, so potentially transformative to her situation, that she almost could not bring herself to consider it seriously. If her instincts were correct, if the father of her silver pup was indeed the same wolf who now sat at the very top of the pack hierarchy, then everything about her situation, the danger, the secrecy, the impossible choices ahead, existed on a foundation far more complicated than she had ever allowed herself to fully acknowledge. She fell asleep eventually, exhausted beyond resistance, her dreams filled with fragmented images of golden eyes watching her from the shadows, unaware that within days, those same golden eyes would finally, unavoidably, find their way to the truth she had fought so desperately to keep hidden. Draven paced the length of his private chamber, golden eyes narrowed in concentration, as he reviewed Marcus's latest report, for what felt like the 10th time that evening. The enforcer had found nothing conclusive at the ancient oak, yet something about the location nagged at Draven's instincts, a subtle wrongness he could not quite articulate, but refused to dismiss. He had led enough patrols in his younger years to trust the quiet signals his body sometimes sent him, signals that rarely proved wrong. He decided, against Marcus's mild protest, that he would investigate the Eastern Territories himself the following morning, combining the search with his regular border inspection to avoid drawing unnecessary attention to his true purpose. Marcus warned him that pushing too aggressively might cause Elena to panic and do something unpredictable, but Draven had grown tired of second-hand reports and half-formed theories. He wanted answers, and he trusted his own senses more than anyone else's. The morning arrived crisp and clear, sunlight filtering through the canopy in scattered golden patches, as Draven set out alone, moving with the silent efficiency of a wolf who had spent years perfecting the art of unnoticed observation. He crossed the border checkpoints, exchanged brief words with the patrol wolves stationed there, and continued east, following the same general direction Marcus had described in his reports, toward the ravine and the ancient oak beyond it. He caught the scent almost immediately upon entering the denser section of forest, faint but unmistakable, a combination of Elena's familiar scent mixed with something else entirely, something young and new, carrying an undertone that struck him as oddly, impossibly familiar in a way he could not immediately place. His steps slowed as his mind worked through the implications, his enforcer training kicking into overdrive as he began cataloging every detail of the trail before him. He followed the scent carefully, moving with practiced stealth through the underbrush, noting the way it grew stronger as he approached the massive, ancient oak tree that Marcus had mentioned in his report. He crouched low near the base of the tree, studying the ground for signs of disturbed earth, and found them almost immediately, small indentations suggesting frequent foot traffic despite the apparent isolation of the location. He approached the hidden den entrance slowly, every instinct honed through years of leadership screaming at him to proceed with caution, though he could not yet articulate exactly what danger he anticipated. The scent grew overwhelming now, and beneath Elena's familiar signature, he detected something that made his pulse quicken unexpectedly, a scent so faint, yet so oddly resonant, that his chest tightened with a recognition he could not logically explain. He pushed aside the covering of brush at the den's entrance and crouched down to peer inside, his golden eyes adjusting slowly to the dim interior light. What he saw stopped him entirely, freezing every muscle in his body, as understanding crashed over him in waves too large to process immediately. Nestled in a bed of soft leaves and cloth, a small pup slept peacefully, its coat shimmering with an unmistakable, striking silver that seemed to glow faintly even in the low light of the den. Draven remained crouched at the entrance for a long moment, unable to move, unable to speak, his mind racing through possibilities that felt simultaneously impossible and undeniably certain. He had seen silver-coated pups only in old illustrations, passed down through generations of pack history, images meant to warn rather than celebrate, and yet here, real and breathing before him, was exactly such a creature, hidden away in the most remote corner of his territory. But it was not merely the silver coloring that held him frozen. As he studied the small pup's face more closely, something in the shape of its features, the particular set of its small jaw, the faint golden undertone barely visible beneath the silver fur around its eyes, struck him with a force he could not ignore. He had seen that same jawline in his own reflection countless times over the years. He had seen that same golden undertone in his own father's portraits, passed down through generations of Blackthorn leadership. Understanding, slow and devastating, began to settle over him like a physical weight. He thought immediately of the blood moon night from months past, a night shrouded in confusion for every wolf who had experienced its strange effects. A night he himself remembered only in fragments, disjointed images of moonlight and unfamiliar warmth, a presence beside him he had never been able to fully identify in the aftermath. He had assumed, in the confusion following that night, that whatever had occurred had simply faded without consequence, a strange anomaly best left unexamined. He had been wrong. A soft sound behind him snapped him back to full alertness, and he turned quickly to find Elena standing frozen at the edge of the small clearing, her face drained of all color, her eyes wide with a terror so absolute it seemed to steal the very air from her lungs. She had arrived for her scheduled feeding, expecting to find her son safely hidden as always, only to discover the one wolf in the entire territory, capable of destroying everything she had fought so desperately to protect, crouched directly at the entrance of his hiding place. For a long, suspended moment, neither of them spoke. Draven remained crouched near the den entrance, his golden eyes locked on Elena's face, searching for answers he was not yet certain he wanted confirmed. Elena stood rigid, her body trembling with a mixture of exhaustion, fear, and something else entirely, a strange, fragile hope that perhaps, somehow, this confrontation might not end in the disaster she had spent every waking moment trying to prevent. Draven finally rose to his full height, his expression unreadable, though something in the set of his shoulders suggested a storm of emotion churning beneath his controlled exterior. He asked her, his voice low and carefully measured, whether the pup sleeping in that den belonged to her, though the question felt almost unnecessary, given the obvious answer written across her terrified face. Elena did not attempt to deny it. There was no point, not anymore. Not with him standing directly at the entrance of the very hiding place she had guarded so fiercely for weeks. She nodded instead, her voice barely above a whisper as she confirmed that yes, the pup was hers, that she had hidden him out of fear for his safety, knowing the pack's ancient laws regarding silver coloring would condemn him the moment his existence became known. Draven studied her for a long moment, his mind working through the implications of what he had discovered, his instincts as alpha warring visibly with something far more personal and far more confusing stirring beneath the surface. He asked her, his voice carrying a weight she had never heard from him before, when exactly the pup had been born, and whether the timing aligned with events from several months past that he suspected, with growing certainty, connected directly to his own fragmented memories of the blood moon. Elena's breath caught in her throat. She understood immediately what he was truly asking, understood that the moment of full confession had arrived far sooner and far more abruptly than she had ever prepared for. She looked toward the den where her son continued sleeping peacefully, unaware of the momentous conversation unfolding just outside his small, hidden world, and she felt something inside her shift, a resignation mixed with a desperate, fragile hope that perhaps the truth, however dangerous, might ultimately serve her son better than continued secrecy ever could. She met Draven's golden eyes directly, drawing on reserves of courage she did not know she still possessed after weeks of exhausting fear, and she began, finally, to tell him everything. The words came slowly at first, hesitant and careful, as Elena described the night of the blood moon in as much detail as her fragmented memory allowed. She spoke of the strange magic that had swept through the territory that night, the way moonlight had seemed to bend and shift unnaturally across the clearing, the way her thoughts had grown hazy and disconnected from her usual sense of caution. She described finding herself in unfamiliar company, a wolf whose face remained frustratingly blurred in her memory, though certain details, golden eyes and quiet, commanding presence, had stayed with her ever since. Draven listened without interrupting, his expression carefully controlled, though Elena could see the muscles in his jaw tightening with each new detail she revealed. When she finished describing the night itself, she paused, gathering the courage to continue, before explaining how she had woken the following morning in her own den, memory incomplete, uncertain what exactly had transpired during those lost hours. She had told herself, in the following weeks, that whatever happened had been a product of uncontrollable magic, something beyond anyone's responsibility, until the unmistakable signs of pregnancy made ignoring the truth impossible. She explained how she had carried the pregnancy in secret, terrified of the questions that would arise if anyone discovered her condition without a clear explanation of paternity, and how the birth itself had confirmed her worst fears when Kale emerged with the unmistakable silver coloring the pack elders had warned against for generations. She described the desperate flight into the forest, the fear that had driven every decision since, and the exhausting weeks of hiding, feeding, and protecting her son while maintaining the fragile illusion of normal pack life. When she finally fell silent, the forest around them seemed unnaturally quiet, as though even the wind had paused to await Draven's response. He stood motionless for a long moment, his golden eyes distant, clearly working through calculations and memories that Elena could not fully access. Finally he spoke, his voice rougher than before, asking her directly whether she believed, based on her fragmented memories, that he himself had been the wolf present with her that night. Elena hesitated only briefly before nodding, admitting that while her memory remained incomplete, the details she did recall, the golden eyes especially, aligned too closely with his own features to be mere coincidence, particularly given the striking resemblance she had noticed in Cale's small face during the weeks since his birth. Draven turned away from her briefly, running a hand through his hair as he processed the full weight of what she had revealed. He was not merely dealing with the discovery of a forbidden silver pup within his territory, a situation dangerous enough on its own, given the pack's ancient laws and the elders' unwavering superstitions. He was potentially confronting the reality that this pup, feared and forbidden by tradition, was also his own son, conceived through circumstances neither of them had chosen or fully understood. He asked to see the pup again, and Elena, though her body still trembled with residual fear, led him back toward the den entrance, watching anxiously as he crouched down once more to study the small, sleeping form more carefully. This time, freed from the initial shock of discovery, he took in every detail with deliberate attention, noting the shape of the small ears, the particular curve of the jaw, the faint golden undertone visible beneath the striking silver coat when the light caught it at certain angles. Something shifted visibly in Draven's expression as he studied his son for the first time, with full awareness of what he was looking at. The careful, controlled mask he had maintained throughout Elena's explanation cracked slightly, revealing underneath it something far more vulnerable, a complicated mixture of shock, wonder, and a fierce, unexpected protectiveness that seemed to surprise even him. He reached out slowly, hesitantly, and touched the small pup's back with just the tips of his fingers, as though testing whether the moment was truly real or some elaborate trick of his exhausted mind. Cale stirred slightly at the touch but did not wake, his small chest continuing its steady rhythm of peaceful sleep, entirely unaware of the momentous recognition occurring just above him. Elena watched this exchange with her heart pounding, uncertain what to expect next, terrified that Draven's initial shock might yet transform into the same fear and rejection she had anticipated from the pack elders since the moment of Cale's birth. She braced herself for condemnation, for the announcement of punishment or exile that ancient law demanded for silverborn pups, understanding that even an alpha king could not simply ignore generations of established tradition without consequence. But Draven did not speak of punishment or exile. Instead, he remained crouched beside his sleeping son for several long minutes, his expression cycling through emotions Elena could not fully interpret, before he finally rose to his feet and turned to face her directly. His voice, when he spoke, carried none of the harsh judgment she had feared, though it remained heavy with the weight of everything he now had to consider as both a father and as leader of an entire pack, bound by traditions he had never personally questioned until this exact moment. He told her that he needed time to think, that the situation before them carried implications far beyond what either of them could resolve in a single conversation beside a hidden den in the forest. He asked her, his voice softening slightly despite the obvious tension still evident in his posture, whether she had been managing to keep the pup adequately fed and warm during these weeks of secrecy, and Elena, surprised by the genuine concern in his question, confirmed that she had done everything within her power to ensure Cale's survival, despite the impossible circumstances surrounding his existence. Draven nodded slowly, processing this information, before informing her that he would not immediately reveal what he had discovered to the rest of the pack, understanding intuitively that doing so without careful consideration could result in disaster for everyone involved, particularly for the innocent pup sleeping peacefully in the den behind them. He instructed her to continue her current routine as normally as possible, promising that he would find a way to address the situation properly, though he could not yet say exactly what that resolution would look like. Elena felt a fragile wave of relief wash over her, though it remained tempered by the knowledge that countless dangerous variables still stood between this moment and any true safety for her son. She thanked him quietly, her voice thick with emotion she had suppressed for weeks, and Draven, seemingly uncomfortable with the raw gratitude in her expression, simply nodded once before turning to leave, promising to return within the coming days, once he had gathered his thoughts sufficiently to determine the best path forward. As he walked back toward the main pack grounds, his mind raced through the complicated tangle of responsibilities now resting on his shoulders. He was Alpha King of the Blackthorn Pack, bound by tradition and law to uphold the ancient customs that had guided generations of wolves before him. But he was also, now undeniably, a father, connected by blood to a small, silver-coated pup whose only crime was being born with a coloring that superstition had long ago condemned, without any real understanding of why. He knew, with growing certainty as he walked, that he could not simply allow ancient fear to dictate his son's fate. But he also knew that challenging generations of established law would not be simple, that the elders would resist fiercely, and that the pack itself might fracture under the weight of such a fundamental challenge to everything they believed. The path forward, whatever it looked like, would require careful strategy, unwavering resolve, and a willingness to risk everything he had built as leader in defense of a truth he had only just discovered, but already felt certain he could not abandon. By the time he reached the lodge, his expression had returned to its usual controlled calm, though internally, a storm of determination had begun to take shape, one that would soon force the entire pack to confront truths about their own history and traditions that had remained unquestioned for far too long. Word travels fast within a pack, even when every effort is made to contain it, and Draven understood this truth better than anyone. He had managed to keep the discovery quiet for exactly 4 days before Marcus, following up on his own lingering suspicions, decided to investigate the Eastern Territories once more, and stumbled upon fresh scent evidence that led him directly to the ancient oak. What he found there, though Draven had specifically instructed the area to be left undisturbed, confirmed every suspicion that had been building among the pack's tracking teams for weeks. Marcus brought his findings directly to Draven, rather than spreading rumors immediately, showing a loyalty that Draven appreciated, even as he recognized the impossible position it placed them both in. Marcus had seen the silver pup with his own eyes, had recognized immediately the significance of such a discovery, and now stood before his alpha, demanding to understand why this critical information had been withheld from him and from the pack's leadership council. Draven, recognizing that continued secrecy was no longer sustainable, made the difficult decision to confide fully in Marcus, explaining not only the existence of the silver pup, but also his own suspected connection to the child through the events of the Blood Moon night months earlier. Marcus listened with visible shock, his loyalty to Draven warring against his ingrained respect for pack tradition and law, and for a long moment, silence stretched between them as he processed the magnitude of what his alpha had just revealed. Marcus finally spoke, his voice careful and measured, acknowledging the personal weight of Draven's situation, while also raising the practical concerns that any experienced enforcer would recognize immediately. The elders, he reminded Draven, held significant influence within the pack despite the alpha's ultimate authority, and any attempt to protect a silver-born pup, regardless of parentage, would likely trigger fierce resistance from those who viewed the ancient prophecy as sacred, unquestionable law. Draven acknowledged the validity of these concerns but remained resolute, informing Marcus that he had already begun formulating a strategy to address the situation, one that would require gathering additional information about the true origins and history of the silver coloring prophecy before confronting the elders directly. He asked Marcus to help him research old pack records, scrolls and oral histories preserved from generations past, hoping to find evidence that might challenge the elders' narrow interpretation of the prophecy's meaning. Marcus agreed to assist, though he cautioned Draven that time was likely limited, given that other trackers and pack members had already begun noticing unusual patterns in both Elena's and Draven's movements over recent days. Rumors, even without confirmed details, were beginning to circulate through the lower ranks, whispers of secretive meetings and mysterious forest excursions that suggested something significant was unfolding beyond the awareness of ordinary pack members. Over the following days, Draven and Marcus worked quietly through the pack's extensive archive of preserved scrolls, stored in a hidden chamber beneath the main lodge that few wolves outside the leadership council even knew existed. They searched through generations of recorded history, seeking any reference to silver-coated wolves that predated the current elders' interpretation of the prophecy, hoping to uncover context that might reshape the pack's understanding of what such coloring actually represented. Their search yielded frustratingly little at first. Page after page of routine pack records offering no insight into the origins of the Silver Prophecy, beyond vague references to ancient warnings passed down through oral tradition rather than concrete written history. But on the third night of searching, deep in a section of the archive that appeared to have remained untouched for generations, Marcus discovered a badly weathered scroll, tucked behind a stack of unrelated records, its edges crumbling with age, but its contents still partially legible. The scroll, once carefully translated and pieced together, told a dramatically different story than the one currently accepted by the pack elders. Rather than describing silver-coated wolves as harbingers of destruction, the ancient text spoke of them as protectors, born during times of great upheaval, to guide packs through periods of danger and transformation. The scroll referenced a specific historical event, a great conflict between rival packs generations past, during which a silver-coated wolf had emerged to unite fractured territories and establish the very foundations upon which the current pack structure still stood. Draven read through the scroll repeatedly, his mind racing with the implications of this discovery. If the ancient text was accurate, then the elders' current interpretation of the prophecy represented not preserved tradition, but rather a significant distortion, likely introduced generations later, during a period of pack instability, when fear and superstition had reshaped historical memory into something far more restrictive and punitive than the original meaning ever intended. He understood immediately that this discovery, while significant, would not be enough on its own to overturn generations of entrenched belief. The elders had built their authority partly on their role as keepers of pack tradition, and challenging their interpretation directly risked appearing as a direct assault on their standing within the pack hierarchy, regardless of the historical evidence supporting his position. He spent the following 2 days considering how best to present this information, ultimately deciding that a full pack assembly would be necessary, a public forum where he could reveal both the discovery of the silver pup and the historical evidence contradicting the elders' current interpretation of the prophecy simultaneously. Such an approach carried significant risk, exposing the situation to the entire pack at once, rather than allowing for gradual, controlled revelation. But Draven recognized that half measures would likely fail against entrenched superstition, while a decisive, transparent approach at least offered the possibility of genuine, lasting change. He visited Elena during this period as well, informing her of his discoveries and his intended plan, watching as hope and fear warred visibly across her exhausted features. She expressed gratitude for his efforts, but voiced concern about the risks involved, both for Kael and for Draven's own standing as Alpha, should the assembly turn against him. Draven acknowledged these risks but remained resolute, explaining that continued secrecy was no longer a sustainable option, given how quickly rumors were spreading, and that a controlled, deliberate revelation offered better odds than an uncontrolled discovery forced upon them by circumstance. He also took this opportunity to spend time with Kael directly, for the first time since their initial discovery of each other, sitting quietly in the den as Elena fed their son, watching the small pup's movements with an intensity that suggested he was still working through the reality of his own unexpected fatherhood. Kael, now nearly a month old, had grown noticeably stronger, his silver coat gleaming with health despite the challenging circumstances of his hidden existence, and something in Draven's expression softened permanently as he watched his son reach toward him with small, uncoordinated paws. Elena, watching this quiet moment unfold, felt something shift within her own understanding of the situation. She had spent weeks viewing Draven primarily as a source of potential danger, the Alpha whose discovery of her secret could bring catastrophic consequences. But watching him now, gentle and clearly moved by his connection to their son, she began to allow herself the fragile hope that perhaps this impossible situation might yet resolve into something better than mere survival, something approaching the genuine family she had never dared imagine possible, given the circumstances of Kael's conception and birth. As the day of the planned assembly approached, tension built steadily throughout the pack, with wolves noticing the increasingly serious expressions worn by both Draven and Marcus, sensing that something significant loomed on the horizon, even without understanding its exact nature. Rumors continued to circulate, growing more elaborate and inaccurate with each retelling, until Draven finally announced that a full pack assembly would be held within 3 days to address matters of critical importance to the pack's future. The announcement sent ripples of anticipation and anxiety through every level of the pack hierarchy, from the youngest pups to the oldest elders, each group speculating wildly about what such an unusual and urgent assembly might reveal. Draven spent these final days finalizing his strategy, reviewing the ancient scroll repeatedly, and preparing himself mentally for what he understood would likely be the most challenging confrontation of his leadership, one that would test not only his authority as Alpha, but his fundamental commitment to protecting his son against the weight of generations of fear-based tradition. News of the impending assembly reached Matron Yvain and the other elders within hours of Draven's announcement, and by the following morning, the small council of aged wolves, who guided the pack's spiritual and traditional matters, had gathered in their private meeting chamber to discuss the unusual development. Yvain, the eldest among them and the most vocal proponent of strict adherence to ancient prophecy, expressed immediate suspicion about the timing and purpose of such an unprecedented gathering. She had heard, through her own network of informants scattered throughout the pack's lower ranks, whispers about strange forest excursions and secretive meetings involving both the Alpha and his most trusted enforcer. Though she did not yet know the specific details of what Draven had discovered, her decades of experience navigating pack politics told her that whatever prompted this sudden assembly likely challenged established order in some significant way, and her instincts urged caution bordering on active resistance. She gathered the other elders, urging them to consider how they might respond should Draven's announcement threaten traditional authority in any capacity. The elders, while respecting Draven's leadership abilities and the strength he had shown since assuming his position, remained fiercely protective of the ancient customs they viewed as sacred, unchangeable pillars, supporting the pack's continued survival and prosperity. Any perceived challenge to these customs, regardless of its source, would likely provoke fierce resistance. Meanwhile, Elena spent these final days before the assembly in a state of constant, gnawing anxiety, torn between fragile hope inspired by Draven's evident determination and paralyzing fear that the entire plan might collapse catastrophically, leaving both herself and Kale exposed to consequences far worse than anything they had faced during the weeks of secretive hiding. She continued her visits to the den beneath the ancient oak, though now accompanied occasionally by Draven himself, who seemed increasingly reluctant to leave his son's side for longer than necessary. During one such visit, 2 days before the scheduled assembly, Elena finally worked up the courage to ask Draven directly what would happen to her, personally, regardless of how the pack responded to the revelation about Kale. She confessed her fear that even if the elders somehow accepted the historical evidence contradicting their current prophecy interpretation, her own role in concealing Kale's birth for weeks might still result in punishment or exile, separate entirely from whatever fate awaited her son. Draven considered her question seriously, his expression thoughtful as he watched Kale sleeping peacefully between them in the den. He acknowledged that her concealment of the pup's existence technically violated pack protocols, requiring immediate reporting of unusual births, but he assured her that given the extraordinary circumstances, including his own role in the situation through the events of the blood moon, he intended to publicly take responsibility alongside her, rather than allowing her to bear the full weight of consequences alone. This assurance offered Elena some measure of comfort, though the underlying uncertainty of the assembly's outcome continued to weigh heavily on her thoughts. She found herself, during quiet moments in the den, studying Draven's interactions with their son with a mixture of gratitude and cautious affection, recognizing in his gentle, careful movements around Kale a genuine paternal instinct that surprised her, given how briefly he had known of his son's existence. The morning of the assembly arrived with an unusual stillness settling over the entire pack territory, as though even the forest itself sensed the significance of what was about to unfold. Wolves gathered from every corner of Blackthorn lands, filling the large clearing traditionally used for major pack announcements, their expressions ranging from curious anticipation to visible anxiety as they awaited whatever revelation had prompted such an unprecedented gathering. Draven had made the difficult decision to bring both Elena and Kale to the assembly itself, understanding that presenting the situation with the pup physically present would carry far more impact and authenticity than describing the circumstances abstractly. Elena stood near the edge of the gathering crowd, Kale wrapped securely in soft cloth against her chest, her heart pounding with a fear she fought desperately to keep from showing on her face, while Draven prepared to address his assembled pack from the raised platform, traditionally reserved for major announcements. The elders occupied their customary positions near the front of the gathering, Matron Yvain's expression already tight with suspicion, as she watched Draven ascend the platform, her sharp eyes immediately noting Elena's presence near the crowd's edge, and the small, cloth-wrapped bundle held protectively against her chest. Understanding began to dawn in Yvain's expression, even before Draven spoke a single word, her decades of experience allowing her to piece together the situation with unsettling speed. Draven began his address by acknowledging the unusual nature of the assembly, explaining that matters of significant importance to the Pack's future required this rare, full gathering, rather than the more typical council-based decision-making process. He described, without initially revealing specific details, discoveries he had made over recent weeks that challenged long-held assumptions about certain ancient traditions the Pack had maintained for generations. He then, drawing on the courage he had spent days preparing, revealed the existence of the silver-coated pup, gesturing toward Elena, who stepped forward hesitantly at his signal, Kale still held securely against her chest. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the assembled crowd immediately, wolves turning to each other with expressions of shock and alarm, as the reality of a silver-born pup within their territory settled over the gathering. Matron Yvain rose immediately from her seated position, her voice sharp and commanding, as she demanded to know why such a dangerous violation of ancient law had been concealed from the Pack elders, insisting that immediate action be taken in accordance with traditional protocols regarding silver-born wolves. Other elders voiced similar concerns, their voices overlapping in a rising chorus of alarm and demand for swift, decisive punishment. Draven raised his hand, calling for silence, and though several elders continued speaking over each other for a moment longer, the assembled crowd gradually quieted, their attention returning to their alpha, as he prepared to address the mounting concerns directly. He acknowledged the elders' fears, stating clearly that he understood the weight of tradition they sought to protect. But he then introduced the ancient scroll he and Marcus had discovered, explaining its contents and the dramatically different historical context it provided regarding silver-coated wolves. He read portions of the scroll aloud, his voice carrying clearly across the silent, attentive crowd, describing the ancient account of a silver-coated protector who had once united fractured packs during a period of great upheaval, establishing the very foundations upon which current pack structures still stood. He explained his belief, based on this historical evidence, that the current interpretation of the prophecy as a curse rather than a blessing represented a significant distortion introduced generations later, likely during a period of pack instability, when fear had reshaped historical memory into something far more restrictive than originally intended. The crowd's reaction to this revelation proved immediately mixed, with some wolves murmuring interested consideration of this alternative historical perspective, while others, particularly those closely aligned with the elders' traditional authority, expressed clear skepticism and continued alarm. Matron Yvain, her expression tight with barely controlled anger, demanded to know why such a conveniently discovered scroll should override generations of oral tradition passed down through countless elder councils before her own. Draven, anticipating this exact challenge, prepared to deliver the second, more personal component of his revelation, understanding that the coming moments would determine not only Kale's fate, but the entire trajectory of his own leadership and his relationship with the Pack he had sworn to protect and guide. Draven stood tall on the raised platform, feeling the weight of hundreds of watching eyes, as he prepared to reveal the final, most personal piece of his carefully constructed argument. He glanced briefly toward Elena, standing at the edge of the crowd with Kale held protectively against her chest, drawing strength from the quiet determination he saw reflected in her exhausted but resolute expression. He turned back to face Matron Yvain directly, understanding that this next revelation would either solidify his position as a leader willing to challenge outdated fear, or fracture the Pack entirely along generational lines of belief and tradition. He announced, his voice carrying clearly across the silent clearing, that the silver-coated pup standing before them was not merely an unfortunate accident of birth requiring the Pack's judgment, but his own son, conceived during the confusion of the blood moon night that had affected numerous wolves throughout the territory months earlier. The clearing erupted into a fresh wave of gasps and murmured disbelief, wolves turning to each other with expressions ranging from stunned shock to visible skepticism, while Matron Yvain's face cycled rapidly through surprise, calculation, and renewed determination, to maintain her position against what she clearly viewed as a dangerous departure from necessary tradition. She recovered quickly, her voice cutting through the murmuring crowd with practiced authority, arguing that regardless of the pup's parentage, the ancient prophecy made no exception for lineage, that silver coloring itself represented the danger the pack had guarded against for generations, and that Draven's personal connection to the child, while unfortunate, should not be allowed to override protocols established to protect the entire pack from potential catastrophe. Several other elders voiced agreement, their expressions hardening with the particular stubbornness of those who had spent decades building their authority on unwavering adherence to tradition. Draven had anticipated this exact resistance, and rather than arguing further through words alone, he made a decision born of both strategic calculation and genuine paternal instinct. He stepped down from the platform, crossing the clearing directly to where Elena stood, and gently took Kale from her arms, lifting his small, silver-coated son high enough for the entire assembled pack to see clearly. The pup, startled by the sudden movement and the noise of the crowd, let out a small, distressed whimper, his tiny paws reaching instinctively toward his father's chest for comfort. Draven held his son steady, speaking directly to the crowd now rather than merely to the elders, his voice carrying a raw sincerity that had been absent from his more calculated arguments moments before. He described the weeks since discovering Kale's existence, the fear he had witnessed in Elena's exhausted face, the innocent, defenseless nature of the small pup who had done nothing except be born with a coloring that generations of misunderstood tradition had condemned, without genuine historical justification. He asked the assembled pack directly whether they truly believed this small, helpless creature, currently seeking comfort against his chest, represented the catastrophic danger their ancient fears described. A long, tense silence followed his words, broken eventually by a voice from within the crowd, an older wolf, named Aldrich, who had served as a mid-ranking hunter for many years, questioning aloud whether the pack had ever actually witnessed the destruction the prophecy warned of, or whether they had simply inherited fear passed down through generations, without any wolf currently living having actually experienced the consequences firsthand. This question, simple yet pointed, seemed to shift something within the crowd's collective mood. Several other wolves murmuring agreement, their expressions shifting from alarm toward genuine consideration of the alternative perspective Draven had presented. Matron Yvain, sensing the crowd's shifting sentiment, attempted to regain control of the narrative, insisting that the absence of recent catastrophe merely proved the effectiveness of the pack's protective measures against silver-born wolves throughout history, that abandoning these measures now represented reckless endangerment of the entire pack, based on nothing more than a single conveniently discovered scroll and an alpha's personal, understandably biased attachment to his own offspring. The clearing fell into competing murmurs of agreement and disagreement, the pack visibly divided between those persuaded by Draven's historical evidence and emotional appeal, and those who remained loyal to Yvain's insistence on unwavering traditional caution. Draven, still holding Kale securely against his chest, felt the weight of this division pressing down on him, understanding that the assembly's outcome remained genuinely uncertain despite his careful preparation. It was Marcus who spoke next, stepping forward from his position near the platform to address the crowd directly, his voice carrying the authority of his respected position as senior enforcer. He described his own initial skepticism upon learning of the silver pup's existence, admitting openly that his first instinct had aligned with traditional fear rather than acceptance. But he then described witnessing Draven's genuine paternal devotion over recent days, the careful, protective instincts any wolf could recognize as fundamentally good rather than dangerous, and he stated plainly his belief that punishing an innocent pup based on inherited superstition, when actual historical evidence suggested a dramatically different truth, represented a grave injustice the pack should not commit. This endorsement from a respected, traditionally cautious enforcer seemed to tip the balance further within the crowd's shifting sentiment, more wolves nodding in agreement, their expressions softening as they watched Kale, still held gently in his father's arms, showing no sign whatsoever of the destructive danger generations of fearful tradition had warned against. Draven, sensing the shifting momentum, made his final, decisive move, formally declaring before the entire assembled pack that he claimed Kale as his rightful son and heir, and that he intended to name Elena as his Luna, his chosen mate and partner in leadership, regardless of the circumstances surrounding their initial connection during the Blood Moon night. This declaration sent a fresh wave of reaction rippling through the crowd, though this time the murmurs carried more surprise and consideration than outright alarm, many wolves recognizing that an alpha publicly claiming both mate and heir represented a serious, binding commitment that few leaders would make lightly or without genuine conviction. Matron Yvain, recognizing that the momentum had shifted decisively against her position, made one final attempt at resistance, warning the crowd that they were witnessing a dangerous precedent, one that prioritized an alpha's personal desires over generations of protective tradition, and that the consequences of this decision, should the ancient prophecy prove accurate after all, would fall upon every wolf present regardless of their current sentiment. Draven acknowledged her warning with measured respect, stating that he understood the weight of responsibility he was accepting by challenging established tradition, but that true leadership required the courage to question inherited fear when evidence suggested a different, more just path forward. He proposed a compromise that he hoped might satisfy even the most cautious among the elders, suggesting a probationary period during which Kale would remain under careful, direct observation as he grew, allowing the pack to witness firsthand that the ancient fears held no genuine merit, while still respecting the elders' desire for caution rather than immediate, unconditional acceptance. This compromise seemed to resonate with much of the assembled crowd, offering a middle path between complete rejection of tradition and immediate, unquestioning acceptance of Draven's position. Several elders, while still visibly uncomfortable with the overall situation, nodded reluctant agreement to this proposed compromise, recognizing that outright rebellion against their alpha's clearly stated position carried its own significant risks to pack unity and stability. Matron Yvain remained visibly dissatisfied, though she recognized, with the pragmatic wisdom of decades spent navigating pack politics, that continued resistance against both Draven's authority and the shifting sentiment of the assembled crowd would likely prove futile and potentially damaging to her own standing within the pack hierarchy. She retreated into tense, unhappy silence, her expression making clear that while she would not continue open resistance in this moment, her skepticism and watchfulness regarding Kale's future development remained entirely unresolved. In the days following the assembly, an uneasy but genuine peace began to settle over the Blackthorn pack, though beneath the surface calm, currents of resistance continued to stir among certain factions unwilling to accept the dramatic shift in tradition Draven had introduced. A wolf named Corwin, a mid-ranking hunter who had long harbored ambitions of challenging for greater influence within the pack hierarchy, saw in the current unrest an opportunity to advance his own standing by positioning himself as a defender of traditional values against what he characterized as Draven's reckless disregard for established law. Corwin began quietly gathering support among wolves who remained uncomfortable with the assembly's outcome, particularly those who had maintained close ties with Matron Yvain and the more conservative elements of the Elder Council. He argued in private conversations that Draven's decision, while perhaps well-intentioned given his personal connection to the situation, represented exactly the kind of leadership weakness that history had shown could lead to a pack's downfall, prioritizing individual desire over collective safety and established wisdom. Within a week of the assembly, Corwin had gathered enough support among disaffected wolves to formally request a leadership challenge, a rare but legitimate mechanism within pack law, allowing any wolf to contest the alpha's position if they believed sufficient grounds existed to question his fitness for continued leadership. This announcement sent fresh waves of tension through the pack, as wolves who had only recently settled into uneasy acceptance of Draven's decision now found themselves confronted with the possibility of an entirely different kind of upheaval. Draven received news of the challenge with a complicated mixture of frustration and grim acceptance, understanding that such confrontations, while dangerous and disruptive, represented an established part of pack tradition that he could not simply dismiss without undermining his own legitimacy as a leader who claimed to respect fundamental pack law, even while challenging specific superstitious interpretations. He accepted the challenge formally, setting a date 3 days hence for the confrontation to take place according to traditional protocols. Elena, upon learning of the challenge, felt fresh terror grip her chest, understanding that should Draven lose this confrontation, not only his own position, but potentially Kale's very survival, would be thrown into immediate jeopardy, as a new alpha, driven by traditional fear, could easily reverse every protection Draven had fought so hard to establish. She spent the following days in a state of constant anxiety, torn between supporting Draven's calm confidence and her own overwhelming fear of what defeat might mean for their small, vulnerable family. Draven, for his part, spent the days before the challenge in careful preparation, training with Marcus to sharpen skills that had grown slightly rusty during his years focused more on diplomatic leadership than direct physical confrontation. He understood that Corwin, while not among the pack's most naturally gifted fighters, possessed significant determination and had clearly been preparing for this moment for some time, making the outcome of their confrontation genuinely uncertain despite Draven's overall experience and authority. The morning of the challenge arrived with the same unusual stillness that had marked the earlier assembly, wolves gathering once more in the large clearing, their expressions tense with anticipation of a confrontation that would determine not merely a matter of leadership preference, but the entire future direction of the pack's relationship with tradition, fear, and the small silver-coated pup whose existence had ignited this unprecedented chain of events. Elena stood at the edge of the gathering once more, Kale held tightly against her chest, watching with barely contained terror as Draven and Corwin faced each other in the center of the clearing, both wolves stripped of unnecessary distraction, ready to settle their dispute according to ancient, physical tradition. The confrontation began swiftly, both wolves circling cautiously before Corwin made the first aggressive move, testing Draven's defenses with calculated precision that spoke to genuine preparation rather than mere impulsive challenge. Draven met each advance with practiced control, drawing on years of experience that had earned him his position in the first place, though Elena could see even from her distant vantage point that the confrontation was proving more evenly matched than she had hoped. The two wolves exchanged a series of intense, closely fought exchanges, neither gaining decisive advantage for several tense minutes, the assembled crowd watching in near silence, broken only by sharp intakes of breath during particularly close moments. The turning point came unexpectedly when Corwin, growing frustrated with his inability to secure decisive advantage through direct confrontation, attempted a risky maneuver that left him briefly exposed. Draven, recognizing the opening immediately through years of honed instinct, capitalized swiftly and decisively, using controlled strength rather than excessive aggression to establish clear, undeniable dominance in the confrontation without causing serious harm to his challenger. Corwin, recognizing his defeat, yielded according to traditional protocol, acknowledging Draven's continued right to lead the pack. The clearing erupted into a mixture of relieved murmurs and scattered applause, many wolves visibly relieved that the confrontation had resolved without excessive violence, while others, particularly those aligned with Corwin's traditional concerns, retreated into disappointed but accepting silence. Draven, breathing heavily but otherwise unharmed, extended a hand to help Corwin rise from where the confrontation had left him, a gesture of respect that seemed to surprise many observers given the intensity of moments before. He addressed his defeated challenger directly, acknowledging the legitimate concerns that had motivated the confrontation, while reaffirming his commitment to the path he had chosen regarding Kale's future within the pack. This display of both strength and grace seemed to shift remaining sentiment further in Draven's favor. Wolves who had previously remained uncertain, now expressing clearer support for his leadership, given his demonstrated ability to defend his position through both reasoned argument and physical capability when necessary. Elena, watching this resolution unfold with overwhelming relief flooding through her exhausted body, felt Kale stir against her chest, his small silver head lifting slightly, as though sensing the shift in tension surrounding them. In the days following the successful defense of his position, Draven found the pack settling into a more genuine, less tension-filled acceptance of the new reality he had established. Wolves who had remained skeptical began, gradually, to interact more naturally with Elena and Kale during regular pack activities, their initial wariness slowly giving way to cautious curiosity as they observed the silver-coated pup growing and developing without any sign of the destructive danger ancient superstition had long predicted. Even Matron Yvain, while never fully abandoning her traditional caution, began showing signs of grudging acceptance, her sharp observations of Kale's development over subsequent weeks, failing to reveal any evidence supporting her earlier dire warnings. She remained watchful, as was her nature, but the fierce opposition that had characterized her initial reaction gradually softened into a more measured, observational skepticism that no longer threatened active resistance against Draven's established position. Elena, watching this gradual transformation unfold over the following weeks, allowed herself finally to exhale fully, for what felt like the first time since Cale's birth, recognizing that while challenges certainly remained ahead, the most immediate and dangerous threats to her son's survival had been successfully navigated through Draven's combination of strategic wisdom, historical evidence, and ultimately, decisive physical defense of his chosen path forward. Seasons turned slowly across Blackthorn territory, and with their passing came a transformation within the pack that few wolves could have predicted during those tense early weeks following Cale's discovery. What had once been a community gripped by fear of ancient superstition gradually became a pack learning, sometimes hesitantly, to embrace evidence and compassion over inherited dread. Cale grew steadily throughout this time, his silver coat maintaining its striking shimmer even as his small body developed the coordination and confidence typical of a young, healthy pup. Draven formally named Elena as his Luna during a quiet ceremony held several weeks after the leadership challenge, choosing a more intimate gathering than the dramatic public assembly that had first revealed their situation to the pack. Elena stood before the smaller assembled crowd, Cale secure in her arms, feeling a profound sense of belonging that had felt impossibly distant during those terrifying early nights hiding in the forest cave. Draven spoke simply during the ceremony, acknowledging the unusual circumstances that had brought them together, while affirming his genuine commitment to both Elena and their son moving forward, regardless of how their bond had first been formed. The pack, having witnessed months of Cale's harmless, healthy development without any sign of the destruction ancient prophecy had warned against, gradually shifted from cautious tolerance toward genuine warmth in their treatment of the young pup. Other pack mothers, initially hesitant to allow their own pups to interact with Cale, given lingering superstitious unease, slowly relaxed their guardedness as they observed him playing normally among his peers, showing no unusual aggression or destructive tendency beyond the typical rough-and-tumble energy expected of any young wolf his age. Matron Yvain, in a moment that surprised many within the pack who remembered her fierce initial opposition, approached Elena directly one afternoon, as Cale played nearby with several other young pups, offering what amounted to a grudging but genuine acknowledgement that perhaps her generation's understanding of the ancient prophecy had grown distorted through years of fear-based retelling rather than accurate historical preservation. She did not offer effusive apology, remaining true to her characteristically reserved nature, but her simple acknowledgement carried significant weight, given her previously unwavering position, and Elena accepted the gesture with the same quiet grace that had carried her through the most difficult weeks of her secretive struggle to protect her son. Draven, meanwhile, used the growing acceptance surrounding Cale's situation to initiate broader conversations within the Pack Council about updating certain other traditional interpretations that had similarly calcified into rigid, fear-based restriction over generations without genuine historical justification. He established a formal process for reviewing ancient records more carefully, ensuring that future pack decisions regarding matters of tradition would rest on accurate historical understanding rather than distorted oral retelling shaped by fear and superstition passed down without proper scrutiny. This broader initiative earned him respect from wolves who valued thoughtful, evidence-based leadership, even as it occasionally provoked friction with those still deeply attached to unquestioned traditional authority. Draven navigated these tensions with the same careful balance of firmness and diplomacy that had characterized his handling of Cale's situation from the beginning, understanding that meaningful change within any long-established community required patience alongside conviction. As Cale approached his first full season of life, the pack gathered once more for a celebration marking this milestone, an event that stood in stark contrast to the fear and secrecy that had surrounded his birth. Wolves from every rank within the pack hierarchy attended, offering genuine well-wishes and small tokens of celebration for the young pup who had, against every prediction of ancient superstition, become a source of pride and even quiet fascination for his unique silver coloring rather than fear. During this celebration, Draven stood before his assembled pack once more, though this time his address carried none of the tension and uncertainty that had marked his earlier assembly regarding Cale's discovery. He spoke instead of growth, of the pack's willingness to question inherited fear when evidence demanded reconsideration, and of his profound gratitude for a community that had ultimately chosen compassion and truth over blind adherence to distorted tradition, even when that choice required genuine courage and difficult confrontation. Elena, standing beside him with Cale, now walking confidently on his own small legs among the gathered crowd, felt an overwhelming sense of peace settle over her that had felt utterly impossible during those desperate nights hiding in the forest, terrified that every rustling leaf might herald the discovery that would end everything she loved. She watched her son interact freely and joyfully with other pups his age, his silver coat catching afternoon sunlight in beautiful, shimmering patterns that no longer inspired fear, but rather genuine admiration from those who had once viewed such coloring as an omen of destruction. Marcus, now serving as Draven's most trusted advisor beyond his original role as enforcer, approached the small family during the celebration, offering his own quiet congratulations and reflecting privately to Draven that the pack's journey over the past year had taught him more about genuine leadership and courage than any of his previous years of service combined. Draven acknowledged this sentiment with genuine appreciation, recognizing how much Marcus's early support and careful investigation had contributed to the ultimately successful resolution of what had once seemed like an impossible, dangerous situation. As the celebration continued into the evening, with pack members sharing food, stories, and genuine laughter beneath a clear sky, untroubled by the ominous fear that had once surrounded any mention of silver coloring, Elena found a quiet moment to reflect on the incredible journey that had brought her from a terrified young mother hiding alone in a forest cave to standing confidently as Luna beside an alpha king who had risked everything to protect their son and, in doing so, had transformed his entire pack's relationship with fear, tradition, and truth. She watched Cale run toward his father with the boundless energy typical of young pups, watched Draven scoop him up with the same gentle care he had shown from that very first moment of discovery in the hidden den beneath the ancient oak, and she felt, finally and completely, that the impossible hope she had allowed herself during those darkest nights had not been misplaced after all. The forbidden silver pup, once hidden away in desperate fear, had become instead a symbol of the pack's capacity for growth, courage, and genuine change, proving that even the most deeply entrenched fears could be overcome when truth, love, and unwavering determination stood united against them. The Blackthorn pack, forever changed by the journey that had begun with one terrified mother's desperate act of protection, moved forward into a new era, one where ancient traditions would continue to be honored, but never again at the expense of genuine truth, compassion, and the simple, undeniable innocence of a child who had never deserved the fear that once surrounded his very existence.